So there's actually a lot of expertise in this audience on this topic. I'm going to walk through a little bit, sort of sensitizing concepts, and then what I'm really hoping to do is transition to having a discussion as a group about these issues, because as I was sort of passing these slides around among my colleagues, you know, there's a lot of different angles you can take, and to sort of maximize the benefit for the room, we really should let the room do some speaking, right? So the reason why I'm here is I recognize that there's people of different backgrounds, and let me go back. There's people of different backgrounds who are going to have different IRB needs, and we put up some articles, PDFs. These are PDFs. That talk about that. So there's a PDF that talks particularly towards the medical field and issues related to the medical field. There's one that's looking at issues in organizational environments, and particular issues in those kinds of places. And there's an overview article by Breiger about kind of giving the lay of the land. And actually, these all come from a special edition of Social Networks that came out in 2005, but is still relevant. And if you're doing defense-related work, there's an article talking about the details of that too. So I wanted to point to some article resources for diving in. And pull up my PowerPoint. I did have it up. No.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next section.
I've already started.
You already started?
Yeah, I did.
I got a wrap. All right, good. John, you can take it over. You don't need me here.
All right. I did lose mine. All right, so let me go to display mode. View. And slideshow. All right, we've already pointed to some resources already. Let's talk a little bit overarching concepts. This is one way to give you sort of a mental map of when you're dealing with IRB, what are the core principles they have in their mind, so you can better anticipate when you're talking about your research design and when you're thinking about your research design, what they have in mind. This impulse comes out of, as many of us in the room know, originally clinical studies. So there was the Nuremberg Code that came out of World War II. Subsequent to that, there was the Helsinki Accords. And then in the beginning in the late 70s and the 80s, there was a recognition that in social science, we also have IRB considerations and issues. And we can think of the Zimbardo study or the Milgram study to name two famous examples. And the Belmont report was a report that was commissioned by Congress, got experts in the room. How do we address these issues? How do we think about these issues? And these are the core principles that the Belmont report came out with, which are then codified in what is called the Common Rule. So we have respect for persons, and underneath this respect for persons, we have sort of three major categories. We have an autonomy, and autonomy is basically we recognize that people are autonomous beings, that they have value, and that they should be informed. We have this concept of voluntariness. Basically, what voluntariness is that the participant in the study or the respondent in our observation setting actually not only within the context of the experiment, so not having someone in a lab coat that goes, by the way, push the button or this experiment will fail, but also in the context of the environment you're operating in, that I'm trying to think of the payment of this study or the award that the participants get is commensurate with the environment. So in prison settings or special population settings, if you're offering $50 and people get paid 10 cents, they're going to do the $50 option, even if that's things that are harmful for them. So voluntariness is both within the context of your study, but it's also in the context of your environment. And then there's informed consent. which we'll talk about in more detail. But the basic idea is that your participant or your respondent should be able to have enough information to make an actionable choice. So the concept of voluntariness is not very meaningful if people don't have enough information to make a meaningful decision. This also links back to autonomy, that if you are working with people children or people with intellectual disabilities, that there's considerations there, right? So beneficence, generally do no harm. But there's also this concept of maximizing the potential benefits of potential harms, and we're going to talk about that a little bit within in this context of network studies. But generally what we want to do is we want to expose participants to no greater risk, if we possibly can, than they would have in their regular environment. So if I ask these questions in a normal context, recognizing that those questions, for instance, if I'm asking personal questions, I do this in a thoughtful way. I have a debriefing that explains why I'm doing this. That I am not interjecting any more risk than doing the activity normally. And then there's justice. We're not riding off of the back of a vulnerable population to get our data to benefit everyone else. Most famously, the Tuskegee study, right? That is a classic violation of the justice principle. Okay, so IRB has these in mind. This is sort of the major sorting criteria they're thinking about as they're going through these studies. Are you addressing, through your design, these macro issues? And now we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. All right, concepts of informed consent. These are the sort of three underlying bullets. We're going to talk about we're going to disclose to potential research subjects information they need to make a choice. We're going to, when talking to participants or respondents, do it in such a way to promote that they can actually make a choice. And we're going to make sure they have understanding what's being disclosed. So if there's terms of art, for instance, we explain the terms of art. We try to use languages as simple as possible. If there's so for instance, if we're saying, well, you might potentially, when you're naming an alter, we actually explain what an alter is within a social network context. All right, this is a big slide. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is, in social network analysis, as in other survey methods, the principal, in most of these contexts, the principal risk is that we're going to do some kind of violation of privacy. That people, and I'm going to do sort of a more specific set of examples. We're going to potentially out people. So, within Ad Health, you could discover that your kid smokes. That's not so great. Or within another context, through a network study, or through a social survey in general, because these aren't just limited to networks, you find out that your husband's in cheating. Not so good, right? Legal risk, and we're going to talk about your sort of implications of these. I would like to get into this more in the discussion phase, but is there an inappropriate relationship involved? If we identify that, what's our ethical responsibilities about that? If there's a person in an AIDS transmission network or in an STD transmission network, and we identify someone who's is positive, what's our ethical obligations to their partners or their alters? And then if you could detect fraud. So for instance, if there are irregular patterns in the way people are sharing patients, is a specific example here, but generally we can see these the distribution of ties, and this is not something that would just happen by chance. In network studies, there's two specific risks that are introduced that are unique from a regular survey research design. And that's deductive disclosure, and we also have this concern about the confidentiality of our alters. And we're going to talk about those now in this a little bit more detail. So deductive disclosure. All right. I have a colleague who has an unreasonable love of fortune cookies. He likes fist-sized fortune cookies. And they're reported on Facebook, his love affair of these fortune cookies. So I can trace him back pretty easily just from the department website and his CV who my man that loves fortune cookies is, right? Fortunately, it's because, so he's in the Trinity Arts Colleges. That narrows down the set a little bit. He's in the sociology department. We only have 2 Arabic speakers, so once we have this, it's really pretty easy. And then my man is a veteran. So there we go. Here, to those in the sociology department, I've outed him. Okay. So this deductive disclosure, we can also think of as happening in a sort of more classic environment. So this is an example from Ad Health. We have 87 black female 12th graders. We narrow it down who have never been held back, narrow it down further to smokes, and we have our potential outing, right? And I would like to say within a network structure, we have one further thing. Because you could do this through categorical variables just in a regular survey design, the shape of the ties could be a potential out. So basically, I'm thinking of an organizational setting where I have a boss and they have subordinates, and there's only so many linkages between bosses. The bosses, I can really clearly, or I have a department and only has like 5 people in it. Okay, there we go, right? So network studies also offer yet another potential risk because we begin getting the topology of the relationships involved. All right, so confidentiality of alters. This is, we were talking about egonatic designs earlier, and I wanted to sort of bring this back. In this case, with an egonatic design, I actually don't need to ask people if the questions I'm asking are things like social support questions about who do you go to for advice or things like that. I don't need the specific identities if I'm willing to say I want general characteristics about social support structures. I can just have people name, like, okay, name your closer friends and characteristics about them, and then I model people that have those kinds of characteristics in that kind of structure, right? But, and so look at this for a second. Same network. It was just broken up. In the ego network, now I want to move, and I want, I'm now getting a global structure. This can be, I will say that if Jeff was here, he'd be like, I could get that for you, and maybe you avoid these problems. But if you are doing global network design, particularly a roster design where the full universe is known, and what's useful about this is these 2 structures have within a, let's say, an epidemiological framework, 2 different diffusion possibilities, right? So the numbers here are the numbers of the paths, and in the top set, it takes more jumps to get from Laura to my mysterious LA than it does in the second setting, and I have one clear bridge. So one classic sort of interest is that I might want to identify these people that have these bridge ties. But I can't do that if I don't have the individual identity, the names of the alters, which then introduces a unique concern of social network analysis studies, which is what do I do to protect the identities of the alters, and are alters people that we need to give informed consent to, right? So we can waive informed consent. We can waive informed consent when the risk to the alter or partner will be minimal. When we could not find this information any other way, which, for instance, in this diffusion example, I'd argue, maybe Jeff could come back and say, well, you could do it another way, and then I'm in trouble. But with IRB, I would say, well, I need the global network structure because my research question really hinges upon knowing this 2 unique structures and their diffusion potential. And so I can't do this any other way, right? So, and then third, am I going to give pertinent information to these alters? That actually, that just sort of depends on setting. So for instance, if I'm in an HIV context, or we'll talk about sex working context in general. It's like maybe not ethical to come back and tell all the partners that your husband or whatever is a John, right? That might actually cause more problems. So what we generally do is we ask for a waiver of informed consent for alters, but we let the primary participants or respondents know. You'll be naming people, and then we also tell them, what are we going to do to protect your identity and the identity of the people you name? One global thing we often do, particularly in situations where there really could be repercussions for being outed, is we can ask for a federal protection, which basically protects the participants in the study from data subpoena. So, okay, like somehow I track back and I find out that you were in the study and that you were doing drugs. And we have the protection. We can appeal for the protection or ask for protection. That can be a way to protect our participants from that. We can also take prudent steps in our design and in our data collection efforts, and we're going to do that. So we're going to focus on data agreements and initial precautions. We're going to talk about data management procedures. We're going to talk about training. And these three areas are another area where I like to get some group input in the discussion section about problems, issues people have had in these areas. So I look at these things as basically helping me figure out whether it really is ethical to go ahead with this study or not. And not just that, will IRB approve my study or not, right? So the first question is, who owns the data? That's becoming an increasingly complex question. So if I'm, for instance, doing online, like scraping online sites or using APIs, now I'm subject to the use agreements of those sites. If I'm working in organizational context and I have an organizational stakeholder I'm working with, we can talk about who has the data and whether that organization, in fact, owns the data. And we can talk about whether that's appropriate or not appropriate. I know some research institutions, like I never will consult for an organization if I don't own the data, because you can have actionable decisions based on that data that might affect compensation or the termination of employment. How will it be collected? So not only like what is the sort of the survey design, but also literally like the script. If I'm talking about sensitive topics, like how will I actually talk about those topics, protocols, things like that. Who stores and processes the data? And we'll talk a little bit more about why that would be important, like what good practices. And so, frankly, from my point of view, I really want to be the one who does this. But how long will identifying information be retained? And who has access to identifying information, right? Particularly if we're working with external stakeholders, this can become a big deal. They go, well, hey, like you wouldn't even be able to do this without us. We should have access to that information. If you don't feel comfortable with these choices, even before you're writing up your IRB, then this is a moment of pause. So data management steps. First step is what I mean by segmenting data. One meaning of that is when I'm collecting data, that I have the identifying data separated from my other forms of data, and in fact, I even separate the keys of that data from the raw data. So that's segmentation in one sense. The other sense actually goes back to this deductive disclosure problem, and I'm going to also violate Peter's forward rule thing. And I want to go back up to here for a second. So for instance, let's say that I want to look at veterans' uses veterans' uses of counseling services, and there might be lots of reasons to do that. I don't need all these pieces of information to do that. I, in fact, might just want Duke University, because Duke University will give me some sense of like what there's as a proxy for socioeconomic status, or maybe because I'm interested, because he's an academic, so there might be some unique profile. And then veteran. And the rest of these things are incidental. And if I take these two things out, suddenly it becomes a lot harder to identify my man who loves unreasonably sized fortune cookies. So segmentation has now also come to include in big data projects ways of subsetting the data for researchers to pursue the questions you want and keep back information that's not relevant to your particular question. This becomes a very involved topic. There's simulation approaches and ways of fabricating data when this becomes, when basically 3 people in your super huge data set have that problem. But this is a topic that people out here may have had experience with, and I'd like to get input on that. But going back to our steps, restrict the number of personnel. I mean, this seems like reasonable, like just sort of, okay, yeah, sure. But I've actually worked in multiple lab settings, and we're used to like working in a collaborative environment, and it's me and my collaborator. But when you begin looking on these bigger projects, and you have a larger team to manage, these questions become really, really important. So having a formal sort of set of procedures about who's going to look at this data, and also talking explicitly about data management early and often. Restrict the processing to data environments. In the old days, I could have taken my computer off and said, like, look, I'm just not having connected to the internet. Now that's almost impossible to do because it just sort of seems like all the software is built in. So you want to be in a secure environment, and in fact, universities have settings set up for this. So like on census data, there's often a unique office for that data. There's other sort of places on campus. Or if you're doing it in-house, at least have it on an internal network that's administered and that you understand the sort of protections involved. Never transfer data over the internet, okay? But another thing that might not be as sort of immediately is like, don't have the key to the data and the raw data in the same place. If you're at Applebee's and you left your laptop, it's unfortunate. And secure your data every day. So obviously on larger projects, you're going to need multiple iterations, and it's good to encrypt what you can when you can, and to lock it up. Have an actual physical facility for that, and your storage devices. And we can talk a little bit more about how people have handled that. Training. All right. I've actually already had to work with undergraduates quite a bit and have them help me collect my data, and actually, have to get IRB training in these things. So this really is the second point, that this is happening earlier and earlier because the ability to get data in some ways is magnified in these amazing ways. So MTurk data or Qualtrics panels or other things. And so as a younger researcher, I'm being confronted up here pretty soon, early. So we do city training. I know, well, what is this? No. Oh, no.
It's a different data user agreement.
Yes. So, the tendency is, and I've had this tendency at certain points, is like, okay, whatever the answers are, let's get it done. Oh, shoot, I got that wrong. I'll go back and just fix that, and then I'll move through. But not only is that, a bad take from the point of view of protecting your participants and sort of knowing the safeguards, you're going to have more times that your stuff is sitting in IRB. That drags out time. It's miserable. So go through this so you know the language, particularly in network studies, because oftentimes you're going to have to talk to the IRB administrator and sort of help iron out. And we have sort of extra onus because of having to be concerned about the identity of our alters and the relational nature of our data, being really, really explicit about the safeguards we're taking. But even then, it may take a couple of talks with the administrator. So knowing what they're going to come at you with is helpful. And so knowing the modules is helpful. So concluding thoughts. So we're all here. So the first point, basically, okay, all right, social network studies are important. And often this global structure is important. And so we need to think about how we protect authors. We need to think about deductive disclosure. And we need to think about also our obligations potentially to participants in light of external stakeholders. And I already talked about it, but IRBs are less familiar with this. So this adds an extra, I'm not trying to be scary, I'm just trying to emphasize be explicit. And now I'm opening up to the room, final slide, because many people have worked in this space and they may have suggestions for each other, and so I'm opening up the floor. So I'll open a question I actually have, and then just as a starting question, and then we can jump. So, how many people have worked with transmission studies or with special hidden populations? So I didn't have an immediate initial thought about, for instance, what if in this case where I identify a participant or a respondent, who is HIV positive, what is my obligation to the alter, to the partner, and how do I go through sort of my stakeholder and talk about how they talk about it? Like, what? Sure.
It depends by state what the reporting laws are.
This is a good time to really speak up.
Oh, sorry.
All right. Sorry.
Excuse me. It depends by state what reporting laws differ by state, and so there's you sort of look at your state laws around that. But in general, there's a lot of protections in that you don't have to be, because this is, there's HIPAA, this is protected medical information, and there could be a lot of reasons why, maybe it's inaccurate and it's not your role to be doing something like that and making that and spreading that information. But strictly, like states regulate what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do.
Where do you find that sort of state-specific regulations?
Start Googling.
Okay, good call. Yeah.
I work internationally, but you also have to go through local IRBs and whatever contribution we allow for and really different regulations. So you have to simultaneous IRB contributions around all the time, but they also have specific country-specific regulations around those populations.
I've encountered sort of a smaller version of that where I'm doing some online data collection that's hosted through what's called the Volunteer Science Platform. Another colleague and I are sort of working together on this. And that is administered by another university that has its own IRB, so we sort of have to know that IRB agreement. And then, in fact, we've had to educate our IRB about what the potential ethical concerns are, because they're sort of less familiar with these platforms. So it's been collegial, but it's definitely been a back and forth. So I imagine like international studies, that's just like a whole nother power higher.
I think it's just to reiterate, get to know your IRB. If you're about to field one of these studies where you're doing your own data collection, get to know talk to your IRB early and often, because so some universities, Duke is very good about ceding control of IRB to a PI. So the PI, the projects at the University of Chicago, Duke will sign on as essentially saying whatever is fine with them is fine with us. Other universities have a very strong local control. If I sign on from the University of Oregon or something, their IRB might say, no, I'm not going to take Duke's IRB. So these can be very, I don't know if it's a feature or a bug, but there's a lot of heterogeneity across settings. And so that heterogeneity can sometimes if dad says no, mom might say yes, right? So you sort of have that option. On the other hand, it can create any one of those flows could be a block to the study. And so you need to be really upfront, clear, and careful about those kinds of things. Please.
Building on what you're saying about multiple institutions working together on projects, I've worked with IRBs in both academic and practitioner settings, and what I've always wondered, because it can be a long process even for exempted studies, for example, when you're working with organizations and not personal data. Are there they always ask for examples, right, of other studies where this is done, so they don't want to be the
The first one.
breaking new ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the good news is the network community is remarkably generous. And so the best thing to do is to send a note to SocialNet and say, look, I'm about to field a study about healthcare organizations, and I'd like some examples of past protocols that have been successful, and some any ideas you have about the hurdles I'm going to pose. And people will almost always come through with lots of suggestions. One suggestion that came up here in a discussion earlier this week is that DNAC might start hosting a repository for these things. So if you've had a successful IRB and are willing to share your proposal, send them to us, and we can create a central repository for those kind of things. So I think you're exactly right. Is that so often, I mean, IRBs are voluntary associations, really. I mean, faculty members, this is a committee assignment they have for the university, and some of them have more or less experience with doing this, and often they're taking on a lot of risk. If you're going to say, I'm going to go out and ask kids who they had sex with, I don't know if I want that responsibility on my hands, right? And so you want to make sure that you can show them that this has been done before and what the reasonable safeguards are and so forth. And so being able to work closely with them and educate them, and if the more of us sort of network folks that can get on IRB panels, the better, right? I mean, if you have your choice of what kind of a committee assignment you get this year, maybe jump on it once or twice and help people out with that. One thing that we've bumped into a lot, which I think is getting harder, is there's traditionally been a pretty strong bright line between social science IRBs and medical IRBs. And medical IRBs are fundamentally sort of geared just because of the volume of work with clinical trials. The way they deal with their thinking and their process is all about the record keeping, all about the responsibilities, all about the features that come with clinical trials. And you come up and say, well, what I'm doing is a survey that's online. It's an ego network survey. It's anonymous. People can, if they don't want to take it, they just don't click forward to the next button, right? So it's, and to them, that's a very different sort of process than approaching a patient who's just had a procedure through the healthcare provider, enrolling them in the study, and following through with whether they get treatment or control and so forth. And so educating a medical IRB about social science process tends to take, it's a little bit of work. They're just not used to what we do. And so plan that into your survey design process, that if you're dealing with a medical IRB that's typically used to sort of the wet side of science, dealing with the social side of science is often a different critter.
Yeah.
Another question about rosters that you use, like if you're doing a whole classroom or a school or whatever. Is it common practice to consent everyone on the roster, or what are the rules about rostering?
So it's complicated. In principle, the ideal design is you would say, you send out a note to the organization or something and say, we're starting this study. Are you willing to be part of it? If so, can we put you on the roster? And so you would get people's consent to be included on the roster. And if someone says, no, I don't want to be involved, they would be removed entirely. Oftentimes that's impossible from a timing standpoint, from a turnover standpoint, and so what you'll do is you'll have the roster built from administrative records ahead of time and include it on there, and then if at the time of the study when you actually go to the field someone says, look, I want no part of this, then you ex post remove them from all the data. So I say, I don't want to be part of the study, I don't want to participate, moreover, I don't want my data involved, and so in which case then you as the investigator have to go and purge that information from the setting. So that's sort of the other extreme. And there's often things in the middle between those two sets. But that's under the idea that people control their own participation, it's there. Now there's one flip side of this is that it used to be the rule in adolescent research that you could do negative consent. Essentially, I could send a note home with kids say, we're going to do the study. If you don't want to be involved, let us know. Right? And so I'm just blanking on the official term for that kind of consent. But essentially, you allow people to opt out. Thank you. Yeah. You allow people to opt out, but if they don't opt out, you assume they've opted in. Now we have the federal rule since Ad Health. We might have caused this problem, frankly. Is that you have to have positive consent from parents to let kids be involved in a study that is done for purely research purposes. And in that case, then you have to send a note home with the kid, and mom has to return that note saying, yes, it's okay for Billy to be in the study. And most of the time, mom doesn't care. She'd be more than happy to have you involved. But the kids lose the note, mom doesn't, everyone's busy, and so it raises the cost dramatically. And so the loophole in this is that if the data is being collected for administrative purposes, processes already, then you can use that as a general guideline to opt in out of that set. Question there, and back to John, or comment?
I actually have a question related to that. So in the informed consent, do you have to let, in these settings, you have to let the person know that they still could be identified as an alter, and therefore characteristics about them could still be known?
Often people do it in two stages. They say, do you want to precipitate or not? That is, do I want to tell you who I think my friends are? And do you want others to be able to nominate you or not? And so so you can actually do these as two separable questions. And it might be, I'm fine for people to nominate me and have my name on the roster, but I don't want to fill out your survey, right?
Right.
And that's fine. It might be, I don't want to be involved in any way, shape, or form with this study, in which case then my name should get scrubbed from the roster and it shouldn't be in there at all. Now, what often happens is then if I'm John's friend and John thinks the black helicopters are going to find him, doesn't want to be involved in the study, then I write down John's name anyway because I have some list of who else are you friends with, right? And so then you have to, if I don't go through later and look to see if this name is matched to somebody who wasn't there, this person is not going to be in my roster. It's going to count as an out-of-school nomination or an out-of-bounds nomination, but there will still be a note that I have a unique person that I've nominated in that category, as opposed to some other sort of aggregated set. Jenny, you had a question?
I guess, because I don't want to say that I, totally believe in this approach, because it's something to really think about, but one of the things that I've heard people do for network studies to not get around those issues, but to address issues of, who's in and who's out, and how can you have informed consent, or how do you get consent from everybody that's involved in the study when, sometimes that's almost impossible when you're talking about sampling whole communities. But it's all about what the network is and what it isn't. So the network is actually the perceptions of the participants
Right.
of relations, and so for that reason, you don't need informed consent.
And so the issue, just so everyone's clear, is this idea of what's called secondary consent. And so if I'm going to do a survey and ask you about your alters, do those alters have a status as research subjects, subject to all the enrollment and consenting concerns of primary participants? And so on the one hand, they are data points, and I'm treating them as data points. The argument can be made that they should be consented into it as everything else. The problem is, especially if you're doing something like an RDS study or some other kind of adaptive sampling process, you don't know about them ahead of time. So there's literally no way you could enroll them even if you wanted to do it in there. On the other hand, you know the universe of people who are possible, but it's a real pain in the neck to consent to everybody that's in there, and it might make it so expensive and so cumbersome that it couldn't be done. And so this is a feature of what is a relationship. One argument is that when you ask me who my relationships are, that's purely my opinion. That's no different than who do I think Santa Claus is real or not. It's not an existential point. It's a perception point. And so I'm in control of my beliefs about who are my friends, and I can be mistaken about it, right? So I think Peter's a close friend of mine, and in fact he thinks I'm a jerk. And so that's perfectly fine. I can sort of nominate Peter as a friend. It doesn't do him any harm. Well, it might by association, but it's no implication to his behaviors from my responses. I think that, and I think oftentimes that's a reasonable sort of control, that the respondent is in control of his or her answers to your questions, and thus that's who you need to consent. I think it's at the same time a little squirrely, right? Because if we really think, if that's what you really believed, then you wouldn't run a fee model over it, right? You must think these relationships have some extant reality, otherwise you wouldn't be looking at them in that sense. So it's a gray area.
Especially people reporting on sex, which isn't
Right.
existential at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Or drug use,
Right.
where there's a real relationship. Yeah.
Right.
And it links to an issue with digital data too, right? So there's this basic concern about, well, yes, it's publicly available, but I put it in a new form and showed relationships that weren't necessarily publicly available until I put them in a sociograph or until I reported them. And I've gone back and forth and talked to people about like the sort of issues with that. So, and it's beyond just the, well, where'd I get it from, and does Google say it's okay? There's sort of this like more general concern about, well, you know, in Peter and Jim's case, well, now that you have this association, even though it's publicly available, I brought it to light. So what implications does that have, and how do we address that with IRB potentially? I mean, stock answers are when you publish the results, your emphasis is on the structure, not on the people. You don't identify the nodes in the sociogram. You report things in aggregate, these things. But there becomes a tension with stakeholders where it's like, no, I actually want to know the bridging person. I want to know that person because I want to do an intervention around those kinds of people. And then there becomes, again, a tension about, you know, what do I do and what's appropriate there. Yeah.
So on the first day, we heard the need for qualitative work in this field to try and identify social mechanisms. Are there any issues that arise that are that much greater than just, let's say, a quantitative network study and then sequentially an unrelated qualitative study? If you bring them together, or are there any additional IRB issues you need to think about?
I just did that in Los Angeles, and they wanted with 2 universities, and each university wanted the standard IRB stuff. There wasn't any in addition, even though we were asking open-ended and sometimes kind of probing questions. They were happy to have just a standard consent. Although it wasn't anything, it was about money, so it wasn't anything overly, I don't know, personal. Don't put money on me as personal. So I'm looking for a better word, right? It wasn't about sex or drug use.
People
I'm sorry you have to
more
deal with
interested-
this.
You're not going to jail though for your income.
Right, that's right.
Unless you show up in the
Yeah,
mail.
Yeah.
Well, okay. This is true.
People are a little, they still are a little close-lipped about their money, but not quite as much as health.
I mean, one of the issues with qualitative research is you get so much more depth of, I mean, you get the potential for so much more depth of information. As long as you're keeping it, you know, I mean, you also have more opportunity as a researcher to let that, to filter that information as a writer, I think. The reactions, thoughts people have on this issue? It's a really, it's a, like I said, the social community is a great community. We've gotten much better at these, and IRBs have seen them now more than they used to. I think the fact that Facebook and your credit card company and your grocery store keeps so much more information on you than we do, people are sort of like, they're not quite as frightened as they used to be 10 years ago when it first started coming out, saying, look, I can reveal secret connections between people that they didn't know is there. That's not quite as novel as it was 20 years ago when we started that help. Peter.
Yeah, just sort of thinking towards that. I mean, I think, you've all heard me talking up already, so not to be on too big of a soapbox, but some fraction of you might end up working in one of these spaces at some point, in which case I would really encourage you to think about, you know, these ethical frameworks. It does bother me that Facebook, for instance, doesn't have an institutional review board. They have instead what I might call a publication review board, right? They don't ask any of these questions until somebody, I mean, as I understand it from people that I know inside the company, they don't ask any of these ethical questions in any depth until you propose that you want to publish your study somewhere in the literature, and they think, how's that going to look when that gets out on the news, right? So there was this whole hubbub, you know, and we're having another one right now about how they're doctoring your news feed.
Right.
They may or may not be doctoring
Right.
you know, your news feed, or the experimental A/B testing that they run on you. I'm always amazed every time that there's a discussion about this in the common media, that there's not more of an outcry of people saying, you know, this is just the study we now know about. Like, you know, that's like the tip of the iceberg of the things that they're doing. And again, they're a private company, they've taken your data, you've all signed it away, you know, you've all filled out the consent form that was so long that we've taken your lifetime to read it. But, so I'm off soapbox, I just want to say, if you end up in a position like this in the future, God, I beg you to think about this.
And look, that's related to Chris's point. When he brings up web scraping, I think he brought it up last lunch, and he's like, don't do it, because there's been a couple of famous papers where they've done legal action afterwards, because the IRB didn't catch that there was a violation in the user agreement of the website. So I went through IRB, and then they're subject to prosecution afterwards. And again, this, I mean, one, there's this side about, well, what about the sort of ethical implications, and that probably was not particularly thought of. But it's also the IRBs, that's a new space. So IRBs don't have a full grasp, and that goes to they're oftentimes voluntary faculty assignment. So you potentially have faculty that know a whole lot about particular modes of research methods and not a whole lot about massive data online collection and things like that.